The water stains on my 7-year-old daughter, Emma's ceiling kept growing, even during the drought, and this thick brown liquid started dripping into buckets we had to empty twice a day. When Emma's asthma got so bad, her lips turned blue, and the ER doctor said there was severe fungal growth in her lungs. From whatever was dripping through our ceiling, I grabbed a crowbar and ripped open the drywall. Our landlord, Harold, had been telling us for 6 months that everything was fine while collecting rent, but the restoration team, in hazmat suits, found something in the apartment above that made them call 911 immediately. Back in our old apartment, there were water stains on my daughter's ceiling that never went away. They grew larger even during the drought. When we asked the landlord, he said it was impossible. There were no pipes above the ceiling. Our 7-year-old Emma's asthma kept getting worse, and within months, she was using her inhaler nightly. That's also when the smell started. Sweet and rotten, like fruit left to die in the sun. Emma would come into our room at night saying her room smelled funny, and we'd find her asleep on our floor by morning. I called contractor after contractor, spent money we didn't have on inspections. They'd come in with their tools and their confidence, tap on walls, check the attic access, then shake their heads. No roof damage, no leaking pipes, no explanation. The landlord went from dismissive to angry, started saying we were problem tenants, that we were making things up to get out of our lease. But then the ceiling started actually dripping, and I mean dripping this thick brown liquid that was nothing like water. We had to put buckets under it, and I'd empty them twice a day, trying not to gag at the smell. The drops ruined everything they touched. Emma's stuffed animals, her drawings on the wall, that little white dresser we'd painted together when she turned 6. Everything got these brown stains that wouldn't come out no matter how hard we scrubbed. Other tenants started complaining about a smell in the hallways, and the landlord blamed us, said we must be hiding something, cooking something, keeping secrets. What really bothered me was the upstairs neighbor. I hadn't seen him in months, and his mail was piling up so bad the mailman started leaving notices. Amazon packages sat by his door for weeks. His car never moved from its spot in the garage, had leaves piled up on the windshield. When I mentioned this to the landlord, he just waved it off, said the guy traveled for work, was probably in China visiting family. Emma's coughing got worse every week. She'd wake up gasping, fumbling for her inhaler in the dark, and my wife Christina would sit with her, rubbing her back while she wheezed. The pediatrician kept upping her medications, but nothing helped. She was losing weight, had these dark circles under her eyes that made her look hollow. That Saturday morning, Emma couldn't breathe at all. Her lips went blue, and she was clawing at her throat. The ambulance ride felt like hours. The ER doctor pulled us aside after looking at her x-rays and said words I'll never forget. There's severe fungal growth in her lungs. One more exposure could be fatal. I drove home like a man possessed and grabbed the biggest crowbar I could find. When I ripped open that ceiling, the smell that hit me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Behind the drywall, the wooden beams were soaked with this black, viscous fluid that clung to everything like tar. It wasn't water, wasn't sewage, it was something else entirely. The insulation was black and soggy, completely saturated with this stuff, and all of it led to one spot directly above where Emma's bed used to be. I called a restoration company, told them we had severe contamination, maybe sewage backup. I didn't know what. They showed up in full hazmat gear, looking like something out of a disaster movie with their white suits and respirators. They set up these plastic barriers around everything, brought in machines to clean the air. The team leader, this guy Alric, took one look at his moisture readings and whistled low. This is something else, he said, and cut a bigger hole to get a camera up there. On the monitor, we could see into the apartment above. The floor was covered in pools of black liquid, just sitting there, slowly seeping through our ceiling. There were no broken pipes, no water damage, just this viscous fluid pooling everywhere. Alric said we needed to get up there immediately, that this was beyond anything he'd seen in 20 years of restoration work. The landlord showed up screaming about the trucks, the damage to his property, threatening lawsuits, but when Alric showed him the video feed and told him the health department was getting involved, he went quiet. His hands shook as he unlocked the upstairs door, and I remember thinking he knows something. He absolutely knows what's up there. The restoration team went in first while I waited in the hallway, but even from there, the smell was overwhelming. They moved through the apartment slowly until they reached the bathroom, and then everything stopped. Alric came back out white as paper and told me to call 911 immediately. Don't ask questions, just call them now. The police arrived in minutes. The detective who came out of that bathroom looked like he'd aged 10 years. He told us the tenant had been deceased for approximately 6 months, that the body in the bathtub had been decomposing all that time, and the fluids had been leaking through our ceiling. Everything that had dripped on Emma's toys, her bed, everything she'd been breathing in for months was human remains. I stood there trying to process this while Christina vomited in the bushes outside. But then the detective started asking different questions. When had the landlord last seen the tenant? Who'd been collecting his mail? That's when everything unraveled. They pulled bank records showing the landlord had been entering the apartment monthly, depositing the dead man's disability checks, paying bills from his account. He'd known about the body and had been spraying air freshener and running the AC to mask the smell and slow decomposition while my daughter breathed in death. When we next saw him, he was in jail. I remember going to visit him to ask why, maybe get some closure, but that's when he said something that sent chills down my spine. Check on your Emma. She might not make it past the next few months. I didn't believe Harold at first, but something in his eyes made me grab Emma and drive straight to the ER. She was wheezing harder than usual, and her inhaler wasn't helping at all. The triage nurse took one look at her blue-tinged lips and rushed us back immediately. Dr. Patel was already there from her last admission, and when he listened to her lungs, his face went tight. He ordered immediate admission to the pediatric ICU and started explaining that the fungal infection from the exposure had created scar tissue that was progressively closing her airways. Christina burst through the doors 20 minutes later with mascara streaking down her face and grabbed Emma's small hand through the oxygen tent they'd set up. The next morning, the pulmonology team wheeled in this huge machine for a bronchoscopy, and we watched on the screen as they threaded a camera down Emma's throat. The images made my stomach drop because her lungs were covered in these black fungal colonies that looked exactly like the stains from our ceiling. Dr. Patel pulled us into the hallway and said the exposure was prolonged and severe, and we were looking at months of aggressive antifungal treatment and possibly lung surgery. The insurance coordinator showed up with a stack of forms while Emma was still sedated and explained our policy would cap at $50,000 for fungal infections. Day 2 in the ICU. I was sitting beside Emma's bed at 3 in the morning, listening to the ventilator pushing air into her lungs, while Christina slept curled up in the chair. Emma's eyes fluttered open for just a second, and she squeezed my finger, which was our old signal from when she was a baby. I promised her we'd get through this, even though I had no idea how we'd afford any of it. Detective Vega arrived the next afternoon with a forensic photographer who took pictures of Emma's condition for evidence. She explained Harold had been charged with manslaughter and fraud and child endangerment, but warned the case could take 18 months to prosecute. She kept saying we needed to keep everything and document all the medical records. Christina's mother flew in from Seattle that evening and immediately took over the hospital vigil so I could handle all the logistics. I spent the entire next day on phone calls learning our renter's insurance wouldn't cover biohazard exposure and the apartment was condemned and everything we owned was contaminated. They said everything Emma had touched needed to be destroyed, including her whole collection of stuffed elephants she'd been collecting since she was 2. My boss granted me emergency family leave, but made it clear it was unpaid after 2 weeks. Our savings account showed $8,000, which might cover 1 month if we found a new place immediately. Christina closed her laptop after losing 3 clients who couldn't wait for her to get back to work. The restoration company's insurance adjuster visited on day 4 and revealed their testing found something called Aspergillus fumigatus, which was a deadly mold that thrives on decomposing tissue. He kept shaking his head, saying in 30 years he'd never seen contamination levels this high in a residential space and that Emma was lucky to be alive. Day 5, they did Emma's first lung lavage procedure, where they flushed her airways with antifungal solution. I held her afterward while she coughed up this black-tinged fluid and her whole body shook from the effort. She looked up at me with those big eyes and whispered, asking if she was going to die. I couldn't lie completely, so I just told her we were going to fight this together. Grace Huang showed up at the hospital the next day, having flown in from Taiwan. She was the dead tenant's sister, and through tears, she explained her brother had been depressed and stopped answering calls 6 months ago. She begged Harold to check on him and even sent money for welfare checks, but he kept saying everything was fine and that her brother was just traveling. A hospital social worker called us into a conference room on day 7 where the whole care team was assembled. They laid out everything Emma would need, including specialized respiratory therapy and custom antifungal compounds not covered by insurance and potentially experimental treatment. 6 months of decomposition dripping through the ceiling into a child's room while the landlord cashes disability checks. That's a new level of nightmare fuel that makes horror movies look like bedtime stories. The estimated costs came to $300,000 minimum, and they suggested we start a GoFundMe and apply for medical grants. I spent that night on my laptop in the hospital waiting room while Christina slept on the chair next to Emma's bed. The county property records website was clunky, but I kept digging through page after page until I found it. Harold Brennan didn't just own our building. He had 12 properties across Portland, all under something called Brennan Holdings, LLC. I started taking screenshots of everything, complaint after complaint from other buildings about water damage and sick tenants and people breaking leases early. My folder labeled evidence grew to over 50 files by 3 in the morning. I must have dozed off because the alarms woke me up, and suddenly nurses were running past me toward Emma's room. Her oxygen levels had crashed, and they were calling a code blue while Christina stood frozen in the doorway, watching them work on our little girl. They had to put a tube down her throat to help her breathe, and Dr. Patel pulled us aside with this look on his face that made my stomach drop. He said the fungal load was worse than they thought, and they needed to try drugs that weren't even approved for kids yet. Christina held it together for almost a week, but then I found her sobbing in the hospital chapel on a Tuesday afternoon. She kept saying she should have fought harder to get us out of that apartment, that she'd been having nightmares about the black stuff dripping on Emma's bed every single night. I held her while we both sat there drowning in guilt about what we could have done different. Grace Huang showed up the next day carrying her brother's laptop and a box of papers she'd found in his apartment. She'd gone through his emails and found message after message where he'd told Harold he was sick, that the smell in his place was making him throw up, that he needed help. Harold had written back telling him he was imagining things and maybe he should see a therapist instead of complaining so much. The detective called while Grace was still there and said they'd tracked down Harold's bank records, showing $18,000 in disability checks he'd cashed after Mr. Huang died. But Harold's lawyer was already arguing that Harold thought the guy was just traveling and that the smell was probably a dead rat in the walls or something. She said they needed more proof that Harold actually knew about the body. We had to move out of the hotel and into the Ronald McDonald house near the hospital, which was actually better because other families there understood what we were going through. At dinner one night, a mom whose kid had leukemia gave Christina her extra meal vouchers and didn't even make a big deal about it. I stayed up late in the common room with my laptop and found this Reddit post from 8 months back where someone described finding a dead rat in their ceiling at one of Harold's buildings. Harold had refused to remove it and told them it would dry out naturally, and the person ended up in the hospital with breathing problems before breaking their lease. I sent them a message right away asking if they'd talk to the detective. Emma couldn't talk with the tube in her throat, but the nurses gave her a little whiteboard to write on. She drew our old apartment with huge X marks through it and then a new house surrounded by flowers and hearts. Christina taped it up with all of Emma's other drawings on the wall, turning that sterile room into something that felt more like hope. By the 3rd week, the experimental drugs were actually working and her lung function went up 15%, but she was throwing up constantly and her liver numbers were getting scary. Dr. Patel said we were walking a tightrope between saving her lungs and wrecking everything else in her body. That's when Harold showed up at the hospital with his lawyer trying to serve me papers for defamation, saying I was spreading lies about his properties. Security had to drag him out while he screamed that Emma was already sick before we ever moved in and that I'd destroyed his reputation. The next 3 days were a blur of nurses checking Emma's oxygen levels every hour while my phone kept buzzing with notifications from the GoFundMe that Christina's sister had set up. People we'd never met were donating $20, $50, $100 with messages about their own kids and how angry the story made them. By day 3, we hit $12,000 and I thought maybe we'd make it through this until the billing lady from the hospital came to Emma's room with a folder thick as a phone book. She sat down real careful and showed us the current total was already $75,000 and going up $5,000 every single day. Emma stayed in the ICU. I spent that whole night on my phone looking up medical bankruptcy lawyers while Emma slept with tubes still down her throat. Christina couldn't take it anymore and drove back to our old apartment building the next morning, even though it was wrapped in yellow tape and condemned signs. Alric was there with his crew still cleaning, and he let her have 5 minutes to grab whatever she could with the hazmat suit on. She went straight to Emma's room and found the baby book we'd kept in a plastic container under the bed, and when she opened it in the parking lot and saw all those pictures of Emma as a healthy baby, before any of this, she just sat on the curb, crying. My phone started ringing non-stop after the news story went online, and 3 different people who used to live in Harold's buildings called me that same day. This guy, Tom, had lived 2 buildings over and told me about black water dripping from his bathroom ceiling for months, while Harold kept saying it was nothing. A woman named Sarah sent me photos of her kid's medical records, showing he got diagnosed with fungal pneumonia after living in Harold's property for 2 years. Another tenant, David Smith, said Harold threatened to sue him when he tried to warn other tenants about the mold in his apartment. Week 4 finally came, and Dr. Patel said Emma was ready to have the breathing tube removed. The whole ICU staff gathered around her bed like it was some big event, and when they pulled that tube out, Emma coughed and coughed, but then she looked right right at us and said in this tiny, raspy voice that she wanted to go home. Christina and I just looked at each other because we didn't have a home anymore and were staying in her sister's basement. That same afternoon, Grace showed up at the hospital with a box of her brother's things that the police had given her. She was going through his notebooks when she found this journal with entries from the last few months of his life. She brought it straight to me, and her hands were shaking as she showed me the pages. January 5th, he wrote that he was getting sicker and couldn't keep food down. February 10th said he'd called Harold 6 times that week, begging for help with the smell in his apartment. March 2nd was about how he couldn't get out of bed anymore, and Harold still wouldn't answer his calls. The last entry was March 15th, and all it said was that he thought he was dying. That was 7 months before we found his body, which meant Harold knew something was wrong the whole time. I gave the journal to Detective Vega right away, but the next morning, Harold's lawyer filed emergency motions at the courthouse saying we were making up evidence and harassing his client. The judge actually granted a temporary restraining order that said I couldn't contact any of Harold's current or former tenants while they investigated. Detective Vega pulled me aside after court and said this could delay the whole criminal case by months while they sorted through the legal mess. I walked out to the hospital parking garage that night completely defeated and found all 4 of my tires slashed with a note under the wiper that said to stop lying or it would get worse. Security footage showed nothing because someone had spray painted the camera black an hour before I parked there. Emma got discharged the next week, but she wasn't the same kid anymore. She'd panic if we closed any door in my sister-in-law's house, and Christina had to leave the bathroom door open when Emma showered. We had to take the closet doors off their hinges because Emma would hyperventilate if she went near them. Even the blanket fort she loved making with sheets and chairs would trigger these episodes where she'd claw at the fabric screaming that she couldn't breathe. Week 5 came, and David Smith called me saying he needed to meet, even though the restraining order said we couldn't talk. We met at this little coffee shop downtown, and he slid a folder across the table with photos of black mold covering the walls of his old apartment and medical bills that added up to $45,000. He told me Harold had threatened to sue him for defamation when he tried to warn other tenants, and seeing Emma on the news made him realize he couldn't stay quiet anymore. The very next day, 2 people from Child Protective Services showed up at the hospital for Emma's follow-up appointment, saying they got an anonymous tip that we knowingly kept our child in dangerous conditions. They made Christina answer all these questions about why we didn't move out sooner, while Emma sat there listening to her mom cry and try to explain that we didn't know what was making her sick. The next morning, I got a letter from our renter's insurance company denying our claim for all the stuff we lost in the apartment. They said we had known about hazardous conditions and stayed anyway, citing something Harold told them about warning us months ago, which was a complete lie. I called them back, but they said the decision was final and hung up on me. Christina was still shaken from the CPS visit when Dr. Patel asked to see me alone in the hallway outside Emma's room. He showed me her latest blood work and pointed to numbers that meant nothing to me until he explained her liver was failing from the antifungal drugs. Harold serving defamation papers at a children's hospital while a kid fights for her life takes bad timing to levels that would make cartoon villains say, maybe we should workshop this approach a bit more. We had to stop the treatment immediately, but without it, the fungus in her lungs could come back even worse. He said we were buying time, not winning, and I felt my legs go weak. Back in the motel that night, Christina was going through medical bills trying to organize them for our lawyer when she found something weird on Harold's property company paperwork. The LLC address matched a management company that got shut down 5 years ago for health code violations that killed someone. The owner's name was Howard Brennan, and when she looked him up, we found out he was Harold's brother who died in prison after one of his tenants died from black mold exposure. Harold had taken over his brother's properties and was using the same playbook. Week 6 came, and our GoFundMe completely stalled at $18,000 after Harold's lawyer sent legal threats to everyone who shared it online. The local news station that had been covering our story stopped returning my calls after getting their own cease and desist letter. My sister was the only family member still helping us financially since everyone else got scared of being sued. Grace called me crying because she'd finally gotten into her brother's apartment to collect his things and found his cell phone still had battery. She played me 17 voicemails he'd left Harold over 2 months begging for help, each one weaker than the last. The final message from 5 months before we found the body was just gasping, and the words, "Please help me, can't move." I spent every night after Emma fell asleep building a website with all our evidence, every document, every photo, every medical record, hosting it on servers in Iceland where Harold's lawyers couldn't touch it. I realized this was his pattern all along, using money and threats to isolate victims until they gave up or died. But he didn't know I'd spent 10 years in IT and had nothing but time while sitting in hospital rooms. Emma turned 8 in the ICU, and the nurses decorated her room with paper flowers and brought in a tiny cake with candles. She could barely sit up, but she smiled for the first time in weeks and made a wish for a house with no scary ceilings. The next day, Christina went to get groceries and noticed a car following her through the parking lot. When she confronted the driver, he admitted Harold hired him to document anything that could make us look like bad parents in court. He'd taken photos of her buying a bottle of wine for cooking and was going to report it as evidence of alcoholism. Detective Vega finally called with some good news in week 7, saying the forensics team found Harold's fingerprints all over Mr. Huang's mail and packages, which proved he'd been in that apartment multiple times. But the DA wanted proof of intent, not just negligence, because the difference was 20 years in prison versus probation with no jail time. That's when David Johnson from 3 units down forwarded me an email from 2 years ago where Harold wrote to another landlord friend that if tenants get sick and leave, he could raise the rent, and that a little mold never killed anyone because they're just weak. This was the smoking gun we needed, but using it would violate the restraining order Harold got against us contacting other tenants. I sat there staring at the email on my phone when a woman knocked on our hospital room door and introduced herself as Sarah Keating. She'd been tracking Harold for 3 years after her own mother got sick in one of his buildings. She had boxes of documents in her car and needed someone brave enough to go public with their story. She said our daughter's case could save other kids from going through the same thing. Emma was sleeping with tubes in her nose when Dr. Patel came in with new test results showing a dark mass in her left lung. He pointed to the x-ray where this ball of fungus had grown inside her, something called aspergilloma that happens when fungal infections get really bad. Surgery was the only way to remove it, but Emma was too weak and they'd have to shrink it with medicine first. The new treatment would cost $50,000 and our insurance already denied coverage twice. Sarah made calls from the hallway and came back with a private investigator named James Morrison, who'd worked on Harold's brother Howard's case 5 years ago. James spread photos across the hospital table showing both brothers at different properties where tenants had died. He explained how Harold testified against Howard to avoid avoid prison and learned exactly what mistakes not to make. Week 8 came, and Christina had to go back to work, but set up her laptop next to Emma's bed. She'd design websites while Emma slept, jumping every time her phone rang because Harold's lawyers kept calling with new threats. The hospital's legal team suddenly showed up saying Harold filed a lawsuit claiming they violated HIPAA by letting reporters see Emma's records. They told Dr. Patel he couldn't talk to media anymore, which meant we lost our best medical witness right when the criminal case was building. Other parents at Ronald McDonald House started bringing us food and sharing their own battles with insurance companies. A dad whose son beat leukemia connected us with someone who writes grants for medical bills. A mom fighting her own insurance company taught us how to file appeals and which words trigger automatic approvals. These strangers became our support system that Harold couldn't touch with his lawyers. 3 weeks passed before detective called saying the DA would meet with us about attempted murder charges. We sat in that cold government office while prosecutors explained they needed proof Harold knew about the body for more than 30 days. Detective got warrants for Harold's phone records and bank statements going back 8 months to find evidence. Emma started art therapy at the hospital, where she drew picture after picture of black rain falling from ceilings. The therapist showed us drawings of monsters living above her bed and our whole family in a boat sailing away from a burning house. She explained trauma comes out through art and the mental healing would take longer than fixing her lungs. Sarah kept digging through records and found something that made my blood run cold. Harold had been taking out life insurance policies on his elderly tenants using some loophole for property protection. 3 tenants died in his buildings over 5 years, and each death earned him between $50,000 and $100,000. She posted everything on Twitter with links to my website about Emma's story. Within 24 hours, we had 100,000 views, and 17 more families came forward with their own horror stories about Harold. Former tenants described black mold, sewage backups, carbon monoxide leaks, and Harold refusing to fix anything while threatening anyone who complained. The mounting pressure forced the DA to convene a grand jury to consider criminal charges against Harold. 3 weeks into the new treatment plan, Dr. Patel showed us Emma's latest scans with something close to a smile on his face. The fungal ball that had been choking her lung had shrunk by 40%, and the new combination of drugs was working better than expected. Emma could walk the hospital corridors now without stopping every few feet to catch her breath. She'd pace up and down the pediatric ward, counting her steps, pushing herself to go a little further each day. The nurses started calling her their little marathon runner, and she'd beam at them through her oxygen mask. I found myself sitting in my car outside Harold's office building one afternoon, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. I'd been having these dreams where I confronted him, where I made him understand what he'd done to my daughter. In the dreams, I'd grab him by the collar and shake him until he admitted everything. The fantasies got darker each time, and I scared myself with how much violence I imagined. Christina found me there after I'd been sitting for 2 hours, just staring at the building entrance. She knocked on the window and climbed into the passenger seat without saying anything at first. Then she took my hand and reminded me that Emma needed a dad who wasn't in prison, that revenge wouldn't heal our daughter's lungs. Week 10 brought the news we'd been waiting for when the grand jury handed down their decision. Harold got indicted on 8 counts, including manslaughter, fraud, and child endangerment. The prosecutor argued he'd been intimidating witnesses, calling former tenants at all hours, showing up at their workplaces. The judge revoked his bail right there in the courtroom. The local news showed him being led away in handcuffs, and Emma watched from her hospital bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She asked if the bad man was going to jail now, and I told her yes, he was. We started looking for a new apartment immediately, but every landlord wanted 6 months rent up front once they heard about our lawsuit. Word had gotten around somehow, and nobody wanted to rent to the family that might sue them. Christina's mother offered to co-sign, but even with her help, we were $15,000 short. The medical bills had eaten through our savings, our credit cards, everything we had. James from the support group called me with news that made my blood run cold. He'd been digging into Harold's background and discovered something nobody had noticed. Harold's mother owned all 12 buildings he managed, properties worth $8 million total. She'd been hospitalized 3 times in the past year for mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't explain. Harold had power of attorney and would inherit everything if she died. Detective Vega and the DA started building their case like they were constructing a wall, 1 brick at a time. Christina and I spent entire days at the kitchen table organizing medical records, creating timelines, highlighting every interaction we'd had with Harold. Well, hello there, Harold's mom. Suddenly developing mysterious illnesses while your son holds power of attorney for $8 million worth of property. What a shocking coincidence that nobody could have possibly seen coming with binoculars and a neon sign. Grace Huang flew in from Taiwan and translated her brother's journals from Mandarin, page after page of desperate pleas for help that Harold had ignored. The journals described the smell getting worse, his health failing, begging Harold to check the plumbing, to do something, anything. By the 11th week, Emma's lung function hit 70%, enough for the doctors to approve supervised day trips. Her first request was to see the ocean, something she hadn't done since before she got sick. I carried her down to the beach because she still got tired easily, and she breathed in the salt air like she was storing it up for later. She didn't take a single breath for granted anymore, closing her eyes and counting each inhale and exhale. Sarah and James went to visit Harold's mother Dorothy at her care facility, pretending to be old family friends. Dorothy was weak but alert, and when they mentioned Harold, her whole body tensed up. She whispered that Harold had been giving her special vitamins that always made her sick afterward. She'd figured out something was wrong and started pretending to take them, hiding them instead in a plastic bag under her mattress. She pulled out the bag and handed it to them, 60 white pills she'd saved over the past 2 months. The lab results came back within days, and the pills tested positive for thallium, a poison that mimics natural illness when given in small doses. This discovery triggered a whole new investigation for attempted murder, and the court immediately froze all of Harold's assets. His expensive lawyer dropped the defamation suits against us when the checks stopped clearing. Emma's medical team finally cleared her for outpatient treatment, saying she could go home if we had one to go to. Sarah organized a crowdfunding campaign that spread through social media like wildfire, raising $30,000 in just 2 days. People who'd never met us sent $5, $10, whatever they could spare, along with messages of support. Emma cried when I told her she wouldn't have to sleep in the hospital anymore, that we'd found a new place where she could have her own room again. Christina started seeing a therapist 2 weeks after we moved in, sitting in that small office with tissues she never used, just twisted them in her hands while talking about how she'd noticed the stains spreading, but told herself it was just old building problems. The therapist, this older woman with gray hair pulled back tight, kept nodding and writing notes, while Christina described how she'd bought stronger air fresheners instead of of asking harder questions. How she'd washed Emma's sheets twice a week thinking that would help. How she'd trusted Harold when he said everything was fine because he owned the building and surely he'd know. I waited in the car during those sessions, watching other people come and go from the mental health clinic, and Christina would come out with red eyes, but standing a little straighter each time. The new apartment was supposed to be our fresh start, but Emma wouldn't go into her bedroom at all, just stood at the doorway shaking her head until we gave up and let her drag her sleeping bag into the living room where she could see us from the couch. Every little thing set her off now. A water spot on the bathroom ceiling made her scream, until I showed her it was just old paint. A musty smell from the closet sent her running outside, gasping for air, even though the inspector we hired said everything was clean. She'd wake up 3-4 times a night checking the ceiling with her flashlight, and we'd find her in the morning curled up by our bedroom door like a guard dog. Week 12 brought Harold's lawyer to the DA's office with a plea deal, 5 years for negligent homicide if they dropped everything else, and the DA actually considered it until I showed up with printed pages from the website I'd found. 43 different people who'd rented from Harold over the years, describing the same pattern of ignored maintenance, threats when they complained, mysterious illnesses that cleared up after they moved out. The DA read through them slowly, his face getting darker with each page, then called Harold's lawyer back and said, no deal, they were going for the maximum on every charge. Dr. Patel spent a whole morning at the medical review board, showing Emma's x-rays and test results, explaining how fungal spores from decomposition had created colonies in her lungs that would need years of treatment, maybe permanent damage to her breathing capacity. They made her case part of the teaching curriculum at 3 different medical schools, which sounded important but didn't help with the bills that kept coming. 10,000 here, 15,000 there, specialists and treatments and medications that insurance called experimental. Harold's mother Dorothy showed up at the police station one day with boxes of papers, her hands shaking as she told detective how she'd found records going back years of Harold taking money from her accounts, forging her signature on loans, stealing her social security checks. She changed her will right there in front of detective, leaving everything to a homeless shelter instead of Harold. Said she couldn't believe she'd raised someone who could do what he did to a child. The detective added another $1 million in fraud charges to Harold's case, and Dorothy looked relieved, like she'd been carrying those boxes for years. Marcus and I started couples counseling because we couldn't stop fighting about stupid things, whose turn to wash dishes, who forgot to lock the door, little explosions that were really about the big thing we couldn't fix. The counselor, this young guy who looked like he just graduated, kept bringing us back to the fact that Emma was still sick. The trial hadn't started. We were living in limbo and taking it out on each other. We'd sit on opposite ends of his couch trying to explain how we felt without blaming each other, and slowly, session by session, we remembered we were on the same side. The courthouse was packed for the pre-trial hearings, reporters and observers and other tenants who'd heard about the case, all watching Harold shuffle in wearing a suit that hung off him like he'd shrunk inside it. He stared at me the whole time, this cold hatred that made the bailiff step closer, while his public defender argued that the evidence was all circumstantial, that nobody could prove Harold knew about the body. The judge, this older woman with steel gray hair, listened to about 5 minutes of that before cutting him off, saying the evidence was more than sufficient for trial, and Harold's face went white. Month 4 came, and Emma started school through a laptop because her immune system couldn't handle being around other kids yet, sitting at our kitchen table raising her hand at a camera while her classmates were miles away in a real classroom. Her teacher drove over every Friday with homework and art projects the class made for her, 28 get-well cards with crayon drawings, and misspelled encouragements that Emma taped to her bedroom door, even though she still wouldn't sleep in there. She was behind in everything, math and reading and science, but she'd sit at that laptop for hours doing extra work, determined to catch up like studying could somehow fix what happened to her body. Then Harold's mother had a stroke while grocery shopping, collapsed right there by the frozen foods, and by the time the ambulance arrived, she was gone. Harold heard about it in jail and immediately filed a complaint saying I'd poisoned her to frame him, that I was systematically murdering his family, which was so insane, the detective just shook her head when she called to warn me another investigation had to happen. The autopsy confirmed it was a stroke, natural causes, years of high blood pressure, but Harold kept filing motions from his cell, accusing me of bribing the medical examiner, of conspiracy, of anything his desperate mind could invent. The medical bills hit $400,000 that spring, these white envelopes that came daily like a plague, and our lawyer finally said we had to file for bankruptcy. There was no other choice. We sat in the bankruptcy attorney's office signing papers that meant we'd lose our credit, our car, everything except the clothes and furniture the law said we could keep, while she explained that maybe in a few years after the civil suit against Harold's estate we could rebuild. But Harold had already transferred most of his assets to offshore accounts they'd probably never find. Sarah from the prosecutor's office called me 3 days later while I was trying to fix Emma's nebulizer that kept jamming, and she said she'd found something that made her stomach turn. Harold had done this exact same thing 15 years ago in California, but under the name Harold Brenner, and there was this family whose 4-year-old son died from toxic mold in one of his buildings. She'd tracked down the court records, and Harold had fled the state when they issued a warrant for his arrest, changed his last name just a little bit, and started buying buildings in Oregon like nothing happened. The case files from California showed up at our apartment 2 days later in this thick manila envelope that felt heavier than it should have, and when I opened it, my hand started shaking so bad I had to sit down. There were photos of this little boy named Tyler on life support with tubes everywhere, machines keeping him alive while fungal meningitis destroyed his brain, and his parents had written these statements about black fluid dripping from their ceiling for months, while Harold kept telling them it was just old pipes. The medical report said Tyler breathed in the same kind of spores Emma had been breathing, the same black mold growing in his lungs, and he died 3 weeks after they finally got him to the hospital. Emma found me looking at the photos that evening and asked what I was reading, so I tried to hide them, but she'd already seen Tyler's picture and wanted to know who he was. Harold's pattern of ceiling disasters across 2 states proves some people treat rental properties like a twisted science experiment, where tenants are the lab rats and toxic mold is the constant variable. I couldn't lie to her anymore, so I told her he was a boy who got sick from a bad apartment like ours, and she looked right at me and asked if she was going to die like him. My throat closed up, but I managed to tell her she'd been really sick and could have died, but she was getting better now, and she nodded like she'd already figured that out, and said she wanted to tell everyone what Harold did, so no other kids would get hurt. The FBI showed up at our door the next week because Harold's crimes crossed state lines, and these 2 agents in dark suits spent hours going through everything we had while asking questions about dates and times and symptoms. They told us they'd already found 17 properties Harold owned across California, Oregon, and Washington, with 64 tenants who'd gotten sick over the years and 4 deaths that might be connected to the conditions in his buildings. The lead agent said Harold was looking at federal charges now, possibly life in prison, if they could prove he knew about the dangers years and kept renting anyway. We took Emma for her monthly lung scan, and Dr. Patel couldn't believe what he was seeing because the fungal ball that had been growing in her right lung was completely gone, just disappeared without surgery. He showed us the before and after images and said most kids would have needed their lung removed, but Emma's body had somehow fought it off, though her lung capacity was stuck at 75%, and that damage was probably permanent. She'd need breathing treatments every day for years, monitoring for the rest of her life, medications that cost hundreds of dollars a month, but at least she was alive. Other families started reaching out after the news broke about Harold's arrest, and every story made me feel worse about how many people he'd hurt. This widow called crying about her husband who died from pneumonia in Harold's building in Seattle after black mold destroyed his immune system, and these parents from California whose baby developed asthma so severe she needed a ventilator at 18 months old. Each phone call added another victim to the list, another family destroyed because Harold wanted to save money on repairs, and Christina started keeping a notebook of all their names and stories. Then Harold's lawyer called to tell us Harold had tried to hang himself in his jail cell, but the guards found him in time and rushed him to the hospital. His defense team filed papers saying he was mentally incompetent to stand trial, that the guilt had driven him insane, but the prosecution fought back with 20 years of financial records showing calculated crimes across 3 states. The judge ordered a full psychiatric evaluation, which meant another 6 months of waiting while Harold sat in a hospital instead of a cell. James from the detective's office called me one morning saying I needed to come see something right away. So I met him at this storage facility on the edge of town where Harold had been renting a unit. Inside were boxes and boxes of documents Harold thought he'd destroyed, including maintenance requests he'd ignored for decades, receipts for bribes to health inspectors, and this journal where he actually calculated how long tenants would stay sick before they'd give up and move out. One page had a chart showing expected tenant turnover based on mold exposure levels, with notes about which types of families were most likely to break their leases without fighting. Christina had started painting again as part of her therapy, these dark canvases showing what we'd been through, and when she posted them online, a gallery owner reached out wanting to do a show. The exhibit opened 6 months after we'd fled our apartment, with Christina's paintings covering the walls under the title Invisible Dangers, and people actually bought them. The gallery raised $25,000 that night, all going to families fighting negligent landlords, and Christina cried when they handed her the check to distribute. The psychiatric evaluation finally came back saying Harold was completely competent, and his suicide attempt was just manipulation to avoid trial, so the judge set a date for next month. The prosecutor warned us Harold's lawyers would attack everything about us, trying to make us look like bad parents who let our daughter get sick, like we were just after money, but we were ready to fight. Emma kept asking when she could tell the judge what happened, and the prosecutor finally agreed to let her do a video testimony from home since the hospital said she wasn't strong enough for court yet. She practiced every day in front of the camera, holding her stuffed bear and saying the same thing over and over about how the bad man knew the ceiling was making her sick. Harold's lawyers filed papers saying Emma's testimony would be unfair and that kids her age couldn't be trusted to tell the truth, and at the hearing, Harold actually stood up and yelled that Emma was faking everything for sympathy. The judge slammed his gavel so hard it echoed through the room and added contempt charges to Harold's case right there. When the trial finally started, Christina and I sat through 3 days of jury selection, watching lawyers ask people about their feelings on landlords and sick kids and whether they'd believe a child's testimony. We needed 12 people who would understand what we went through wasn't just some maintenance issue, but actual evil. Month 7 came, and the prosecutor stood up for opening statements, showing the jury photos of Emma on life support with tubes down her throat while explaining how Harold collected a dead man's checks for 6 months. Harold's lawyer got up and painted us as problem tenants who never paid rent on time and were looking for a payday, which made Christina squeeze my hand so hard I thought she'd break it. Grace flew in from Taiwan to testify about her brother's last months, and she played these voicemails in court where you could hear Mr. Huang getting weaker, begging Harold to fix the smell in his apartment, saying he couldn't breathe. Harold just sat there taking notes like he was planning his next property deal while jurors wiped their eyes. Dr. Patel came next with Emma's lung scans on a big screen, pointing to the fungal colonies that had grown inside her airways from breathing in decomposition, explaining how she almost died 3 times. The defense lawyer tried to say he wasn't qualified to make those connections, but Dr. Patel pulled out study after study showing exactly how human decomposition creates toxic fungal spores. When they called me to testify, I walked up there with my legs shaking and told them about finding the body, about the black fluid dripping on my daughter's toys, about trusting that landlords couldn't just let people die in their buildings. Harold's lawyer attacked me for not moving out sooner, saying any good father would have left immediately, and I lost it right there on the stand. Christina testified next about the nights she thought Emma would die in her arms, looking straight at Harold when she said he collected rent while her baby was dying, and Harold actually smirked, which 2 jurors definitely saw. They played Emma's video testimony on day 5, and she was so matter-of-fact about the yucky ceiling and how her lungs felt like fire. But when they asked if she was mad at Harold, she just said he should say sorry to Mr. Huang because he can't breathe at all anymore. The whole courtroom went dead silent after that. Harold decided to testify against his lawyer's advice, sitting up there claiming he was the victim of tenants trying to get free housing. But when the prosecutor started asking about the disability checks and the voicemails and why he never called 911, his story fell apart. They showed him photos of Mr. Huang's decomposed body in that bathtub and asked him to explain how he didn't know for 6 months, and his face went white as he stammered about being too busy with other properties. The prosecutor pulled out a stack of papers and walked to the audio equipment, telling the judge she had recordings from the county jail that would show Harold's true character. Harold's lawyer jumped up objecting, but the judge allowed it, and soon Harold's voice filled the courtroom, talking to his cellmate about how he should have just burned the whole building down to destroy the evidence. The recording kept playing with Harold describing offshore accounts he'd set up years ago, properties he'd hidden under fake companies, and how he was planning to flee to Thailand where they couldn't extradite him once he made bail. He laughed on the tape about the stupid tenants who never figured out what was really happening, said Mr. Huang was already dead, so what difference did it make? And that little girl with asthma was probably faking it for attention anyway. The jury members looked sick as they listened, one woman covering her mouth, another man shaking his head in disgust. Harold tried to say the recordings were taken out of context, but nobody was buying it anymore. The closing arguments took 3 hours the next morning. The prosecutor stood in front of Emma's photo from the hospital, tubes down her throat, and reminded everyone how she almost died breathing in human remains for 6 months. She showed Mr. Huang's passport photo from when he first came to America, full of hope, and contrasted it with the crime scene photos of his lonely death in that bathtub. She listed every single one of Harold's lies, every forged document, every stolen check, building her case piece by piece, until there was no doubt left. The defense attorney did his best, arguing that Harold made mistakes, but didn't intend harm, that the evidence was circumstantial, that his client deserved reasonable doubt, but you could tell his heart wasn't in it after hearing those jail recordings. The jury went to deliberate Thursday afternoon, and we waited. Christina and I sat in the courthouse cafeteria with Grace, none of us able to eat, just drinking coffee and checking our phones every few minutes. Harold's really going for the Villain Lifetime Achievement Award here, complete with recorded confession highlighting his greatest hits of evil landlording. Nothing says I'm innocent quite like jail calls about burning evidence and fleeing to Thailand. Emma stayed with Christina's mom, calling every hour asking if the bad man was going to jail yet. We waited through Thursday night, came back Friday morning, waited more. The deliberation stretched to 14 hours total. Finally, around 2 o'clock Friday, the bailiff came out and said they had a verdict. My hands were shaking as we filed back into the courtroom. The jury foreman stood up and started reading. Guilty of involuntary manslaughter, guilty of fraud, guilty of child endangerment, guilty on 43 counts total. Harold stared right at me as they handcuffed him, mouthing the words, "This isn't over," but it was. The judge denied bail pending sentencing, said Harold was a flight risk based on his own recorded statements. He'd never manage another property, never collect another rent check, never put another family through what he put us through. 2 weeks later, we attended Mr. Huang's proper memorial service that Grace organized at a Buddhist temple downtown. Emma drew a picture of Mr. Huang healthy and smiling, standing in clouds with angels around him, and placed it with the other offerings. Grace hugged us afterward, tears streaming down her face, saying her brother could finally rest knowing justice was done. The other tenants from the building came too, all of us bonded by what we'd survived together. The sentencing hearing came a month later. The judge didn't hold back, calling Harold a predator who monetized human suffering, who chose profit over human life again and again. 25 to life, eligible for parole in 20 years. The courtroom erupted in quiet relief, people hugging, some crying. The civil suit against Harold's estate started right after, with 43 families seeking damages for everything from medical bills to emotional trauma. Our lawyer said it would take years to sort through Harold's hidden assets, but there was hope we'd see some compensation eventually. We moved to a new apartment across town, smaller but clean, with working smoke detectors and windows that actually opened. Emma went back to school part-time, wearing a mask and carrying her inhaler everywhere. Her teacher knew to watch for breathing problems, had our number on speed dial. It wasn't the normal childhood she deserved, but it was progress. She'd made friends with another girl who had severe allergies, and they looked out for each other during recess. Christina's art exhibition opened 3 months after the trial at a gallery downtown. She'd painted our whole experience, turning trauma into powerful images that made people stop and stare. The proceeds went to a fund supporting families living in substandard housing. She spoke at the opening for the first time publicly about what happened, her voice steady as she described Emma's suffering and Harold's cruelty. Every painting sold that night, raising awareness and thousands of dollars for the cause. 6 months after the trial, we sat in Dr. Patel's office for Emma's latest test results. Her lung function had stabilized at 75%, the fungal growth hadn't returned, and the new medication regimen was working. She'd need monitoring for life, would always carry that inhaler, but she was going to be okay. Emma hugged Dr. Patel so tight he laughed, this man who'd saved her when Harold had been willing to let her die for profit. Now I watch Emma playing at the park, her laughter ringing out between puffs from her inhaler. Christina sketches us from a bench, working on her next series about families rebuilding after trauma. We're broke from medical bills and legal fees. We all have nightmares about ceilings dripping, and Emma will carry those scars in her lungs forever. But we're here, we're together, we survived. Emma runs over to me, breathing hard but grinning, and says the words that make everything worth it. "Daddy, I'm not scared of ceilings anymore." I pull her close, feeling her small heart beating against mine, knowing that's the only victory that really matters. 25 to life for Harold? Talk about the ultimate eviction notice. Emma's out here swapping ceiling fears for playground cheers, and meanwhile, Dad's finally waking up to reality. Wild stuff, like the video. It helps more than you think.